This is a 1983 R100RS, and I'm getting ready to remove the clutch and the flywheel so I can replace the rear main seal and the O-ring inside the oil pump cover. But before I do that work, I need to be sure the crankshaft won't move. The reason for that is that inside the engine toward the rear there's a thrust washer on the crank, and it sits on two small pins molded into the case of the engine. If it happens to fall off, you pretty much have to remove the crankshaft to get in there to put it back on. And if it falls off and you don't notice, when you tighten up the flywheel bolts, you'll likely crush that washer. You very likely will damage the crankshaft as well as shear off those pins on the engine block. All of that's pretty ugly and a catastrophe, so you don't want that to happen. To keep that from happening, I use a small M6 bolt, which is about 12 millimeters long, and I place it inside the bolt head that holds the rotor onto the crank. Then, when I put the cover on, I just tighten up the two cover bolts by hand so they're snug, and that puts pressure on that bolt inside the bolt for the alternator rotor, and it pushes the crank all the way to the back so that the thrust washer can't come off. So that's what you should do every time you pull the flywheel. So I just snug up the two cover bolts by hand. You don't have to get really tight. In fact, you don't want to get really tight. You just want to snug it up. And then what I like to do is verify that I have a small gap down at the bottom here. And I think you can see that there's just a small gap. That means that the cover is pressing on the bolt, and that's forcing the crank to go to the rear up against the thrust washer, thereby preventing catastrophe. So my catastrophe insurance is installed. So to remove the flywheel, I have to loosen up these 5 19 millimeter bolts. But before I do that, I positioned the flywheel so that it's at top dead center right here through the timing window. And this is the little tab of metal that has the timing marks. That will be required, so when I put the flywheel back on, the timing marks are in the right place in relation to the crank and camshaft. Now, just as a little added insurance, I put a white mark here next to this bolt and another white mark on the engine case. So when I go to put the flywheel back on, I'll make sure that this lines up with that. And second, I'll make sure that I don't turn the crank. It's set at top dead center, so everything should be right on the money. Now, to remove them, I'm going to use my air hammer or my air wrench, and I think I can get it to just pop free, so let's see what happens here. Yep, popped it right off. There we go. So just all the way around, and we've got it done. So I'm ready to remove the flywheel, and I've run in a clutch bolt in every other hole like that. And then I've got a pair of vice grips, and I'm just going to grab each of these and give a tug, and then another tug, and another tug, and the flywheel's coming right off. There we go. Of course, you have to kind of keep it square to the bell housing or it'll jam a little bit. But there we are. So it's loose. Now, one other piece of insurance that I'm going to do is this is my mark on the case So this is the bolt hole that I want to put that flywheel hole bolt in. So this crankcase bolt hole lines up with this hole in the flywheel, and that mark lines up with this on the engine case. So that protects me should I inadvertently rotate the crankshaft. But there it is, we've got it off, and that's the part that fits on the nose. And as you can see here, this is where the seal has rubbed, and so that's part of why there's a little bit of oil leakage, but we'll get that fixed here. As insurance, I used my punch and put a couple of holes right next to this flywheel bolt hole, and then I did the same thing over here on the crankshaft nose. I put a couple little punch marks next to this hole. So I'll always get the flywheel in the correct crankshaft hole, and the timing won't get messed up even if the paint marks disappear. This is the inside of the bell housing after I gave it a thorough bath. I always do that before I replace the rear main seal or the oil pump cover O-ring. I believe that anytime you work on the inside of an engine, you want everything around it spick and span, spotlessly clean, because you don't want to get garbage inside the engine. I know some people think that it's okay to leave the bell housing dirty. It's just going to get dirty again, but I don't buy that. I think it's time to clean out 40 years worth of garbage, get rid of all the oil and clutch debris, and make it look spotless. And my goal when I get done is to feel like I could eat my lunch in there without any real problem. The way I go about it is I use kerosene and a paintbrush, and I paint the inside of that housing with the brush and scrub away. And that gets a lot of the deposits out. And then I finish up with engine degreaser. I kind of like the foamy kind because it lifts a lot of the particles up and out. And it also gets rid of the kerosene. When I finished with that and wiped it all down with copious numbers of blue shop towels, the last thing I do is I run some carb cleaner, and I get all the small deposits that are in the little nooks and crannies, like in here where the webbing is, and up here in the top where the starter motor goes. So it shines. And then I'm ready to go do the work of replacing the seals without any concern that I'm going to put garbage and junk inside the engine while I do that work. Now, before I pulled the flywheel, I showed how to block the crankshaft so that it was pushed all the way to the rear. And this is that thrust washer, except there's another one inside the case that I was worried about. But they're the same, and they are mounted the same way. So looking at the rear thrust washer, here's the two pins that the washer fits on. And the one on the inside of the case is mounted the same way. The problem is, if while doing the work, when you're pulling the flywheel and changing out the seal, you manage to knock that thrust washer off those pins, then you've got a potential catastrophe because you will damage the thrust washer, the crankshaft, and likely mash these pins if you tighten up the flywheel bolts and that thrust washer inside the engine case is loose. So I thought I'd show you what I was talking about. This is a rear main seal puller kit that I got from CycleWorks. It consists of an aluminum plate with holes drilled through it that match up with the flywheel bolt holes. And it has two threaded holes here and here that you run these sharp screws in so they pierce the edge of the seal and capture it. Now you attach it using two of the existing flywheel bolts, and then you run the center bolt in, and it presses against the face of the crankshaft, pulling the whole assembly this way, and that pulls the seal out. So it's a nice, simple little toolkit. So I've threaded in 2 of the flywheel bolts to position the metal plate, and then I run these screws in, the sharp pointed sheet metal screws. I run them in and tighten them up so they pierce the edge of the seal, and that's fairly tough material, so you may have to lean on it a little bit to get it to go in. And then when I get them in like that, I've got the seal caught. So then what I want to do is back out the flywheel bolts like this, and then I just get these out of here, and then I'll thread my center bolt in as a puller and run it down against the nose of the crankshaft, and there it's snug. And I just keep tightening it up with a crescent, and we should get the seal to come loose as we keep going. Well, I didn't get my screws in far enough, so I have to go back and do that again. I removed the black disc and then used my heat gun to heat up the perimeter of the engine block around the seal, as I show in this picture from an earlier bike that I worked on. That's a good idea in any event, just to make it a little easier to pull the seal out. So I've got the screws laid in, but I had to use my electric drill to get the screws to go in tight, and I backed it out, and there's the seal pulled out. You can see the screws went into the edge of the seal. So I've got the old seal out, and we'll get ready to put the new one in.